In September of 1893, a tenant farming family in rural Bastrop County, Texas, stopped attending Sunday services at Cedar Creek Baptist Church. When the county sheriff finally rode out to investigate 3 weeks later, he found 17 people living in a 2-room sharecropper's cabin built for 6. The Caldwell family insisted all 17 had always lived there. Medical records from Dr. Samuel Norton tell a different story. According to his journal, dated June 3, 1893, the family consisted of exactly 5 members. The summer of 1893 brought more than drought to central Texas. A national depression had crushed cotton prices to 6 cents per pound. Tenant farmers like Thomas Caldwell found themselves trapped between failed crops and mounting debts to landowners who showed no mercy. The Caldwell family worked 40 acres of sandy bottomland along the Colorado River, growing cotton they couldn't sell and corn that barely kept them fed. Dr. Samuel Norton's patient ledger contains the first documented record of the Caldwell family. On June 3rd, he made a house call to their cabin, treating Martha Caldwell for what he described as nervous debility brought on by overwork and insufficient diet. His notes list the family members present: Thomas Caldwell, age 38, head of household; Martha Caldwell, age 34, wife; James Caldwell, age 14, eldest son; Sarah Caldwell, age 11, daughter; William Caldwell, age 8, youngest son. 5 people. The doctor noted the family's desperate circumstances, but found nothing unusual about the household itself. That changed on September 9th. Reverend Augustus Clay kept detailed attendance records for Cedar Creek Baptist Church. The Caldwells attended services every Sunday without fail, sitting in the same back pew they'd occupied for 3 years. On September 3rd, Reverend Clay noted 5 Caldwells present, same as always. On September 10th, he counted 6. When he questioned Thomas Caldwell about the unfamiliar young woman sitting with the family, Thomas looked confused. "That's our Mary, Reverend. She's been with us since she was born."
But Reverend Clay had baptized every Caldwell child. There was no Mary.
The Reverend's personal diary entry from that evening reveals his growing unease. He wrote that the young woman appeared to be about 16 years old, with dark hair and Martha's same narrow features. When he asked Mary about her baptism, she provided specific details about a ceremony that never happened. She described the dress she'd worn, the hymns they'd sung, even the feeling of the water. Thomas and Martha confirmed every detail. James, Sarah, and William all remembered their sister Mary. They always had a sister Mary. Reverend Clay searched his records going back 5 years. No baptism, no Mary Caldwell. Yet when he rode out to the Caldwell cabin 3 days later, Mary answered the door. She knew him, called him by name, asked about his wife's catarrh with genuine concern. She existed, solid and real, with memories and mannerisms and a place at the family table. She also had a twin sister named Margaret, who'd appeared on September 11th. Now there were 7 Caldwells where there had been 5 just days before. Thomas accepted this as natural. So did Martha and James and Sarah and William and Mary. They all remembered Margaret. They'd always had Margaret. When Reverend Clay pointed out the impossibility, Thomas grew agitated. He listed his children slowly, counting on his fingers. James, Sarah, William, Mary, Margaret. 5 children, like always. The Reverend tried to show him the baptismal records. Thomas couldn't read well, but he understood numbers. 5 children baptized, 5 children at home, everything in order. Except Reverend Clay distinctly remembered only 3 children a week ago. The Reverend stopped attending to the Caldwells after that. His diary entries become sparse and troubled. He mentions consulting medical texts about group delusions and nervous afflictions brought on by poverty. He questions his own memory. By September 20th, he'd convinced himself he'd simply forgotten about Mary and Margaret. Perhaps the girls had been sick for a long time, confined to the cabin. Perhaps his memory was failing in his old age. Then the Caldwells stopped coming to church entirely. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher lived on the neighboring property, a quarter mile through the pine woods. Her statement to Sheriff Coleman Briggs, recorded October 2nd, provides the next piece of documentation. She reported seeing the Caldwells working their cotton field on September 24th. She counted 9 people in the field, which struck her as odd because the Caldwells had always struggled with too few hands to work their acreage. She thought perhaps they'd hired help, though she couldn't imagine how they'd pay for it. The next day, she counted 10 people working the field. Mrs. Fletcher's testimony becomes harder to follow after this point. She describes watching the Caldwell property through her kitchen window, counting the figures moving between the cabin and the field. Each day brought at least one more, sometimes 2. By September 30th, she counted 15 people. She recognized Thomas by his hat, Martha by her faded blue dress, but the others were strangers, young and old, men and women, all working with the same methodical efficiency, all moving in and out of that small 2-room cabin. When she mentioned this to her husband Ernest, he told her she was seeing double from eye strain. When she insisted, he grew angry. He said the Caldwells had always had a large family. Everyone knew that. She'd probably just never paid attention before. Mrs. Fletcher stopped arguing, but she kept counting. 15 became 16. 16 became 17. The local general store ledger shows Thomas Caldwell made purchases on September 28th. He bought the usual supplies: flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil. The store owner, Mr. Raymond Price, noted the purchase in his account book, but also made a personal notation in the margin. He wrote that Thomas had mentioned needing extra provisions for harvest time with so many mouths to feed. When Mr. Price asked how many people were staying at the Caldwell place, Thomas had said 17. Mr. Price assumed he meant temporary workers brought in for harvest. He didn't question it further. What he did question was Thomas's appearance. In his statement to the sheriff, Mr. Price described Thomas as having an unnaturally calm demeanor. His eyes were clear but somehow distant. He spoke about his large family with absolute certainty, showing none of the stress or exhaustion you'd expect from a man struggling through a depression with 17 dependents. He seemed content, almost serene. Dr. Norton's journal provides medical context for what happened next. On October 1st, Martha Caldwell's sister, Elizabeth Simmons, rode 12 miles from Austin to consult with him. She hadn't seen Martha in over a month, which was unusual. When she'd sent a letter asking to visit, Martha had written back saying the family was too busy with harvest to receive guests. Elizabeth found this suspicious. Martha always made time for family, no matter how hard the work. Dr. Norton agreed to ride out with Elizabeth to check on Martha's health. They arrived at the Caldwell cabin on the afternoon of October 1st. The doctor's journal entry from that evening is difficult to read, his handwriting shaky and rushed. He describes approaching the cabin and seeing people everywhere, working in the field, hauling water from the well, sitting on the porch, too many people for such a small property. When he called out for Thomas, at least 6 different people turned to look at him. When he called for Martha, 4 women responded. Thomas Caldwell emerged from the cabin and greeted Dr. Norton warmly, as though nothing was unusual. The doctor asked how many people were currently living on the property. Thomas thought for a moment, then started counting aloud, pointing at each person in turn. He reached 17 and stopped, satisfied. Dr. Norton asked him to point out his wife Martha. Thomas pointed to a woman hanging laundry. That wasn't the Martha the doctor had treated in June. This woman was younger, perhaps 30, with lighter hair. When Dr. Norton protested, Thomas laughed and pointed to another woman kneeling in the garden. "That's Martha too," he said. "We've got 3 Marthas now. Helps with the work." Elizabeth Simmons became hysterical at this point. None of the women resembled her sister. She ran through the property, grabbing people, demanding to know who they were and where they'd come from. Every person she questioned gave detailed answers. They had names. They had memories. They knew the property intimately. They all belonged to the Caldwell family. They always had. Dr. Norton attempted to examine several of the individuals. In his journal, he notes that all appeared physically healthy despite the cramped living conditions. No signs of disease or malnutrition. Their pupils responded normally to light. Their speech was coherent. But when he asked specific questions about their past, Their answers didn't align with any records or memories from the actual Caldwell family. They described childhoods that never happened in places the real Caldwells had never lived. Yet they believed every word. The doctor's final note from that visit is the most disturbing. He wrote that as he was preparing to leave, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Every single person on that property looked slightly like Thomas or Martha Caldwell. Not identical, but similar enough to suggest family relation. The same slope of the nose, the same set of the jaw, as though they were all variations of the same two people, multiplied and scattered across different ages and genders. He left immediately and advised Elizabeth Simmons to do the same. Sheriff Coleman Briggs received multiple complaints about the Caldwell property in early October. Neighbors reported seeing too many people coming and going from the small cabin. Some claimed the property was being used as a boarding house without permission from the landowner. Others worried about disease spreading from overcrowded conditions. The sheriff initially dismissed these concerns as gossip, but by October 10th, even he couldn't ignore the reports anymore. His official incident report, filed October 12th, documents his visit to the Caldwell property. He arrived mid-morning with Deputy Andrew Mills. They found 19 people living on the property. The sheriff counted twice to be sure. 19 individuals, all claiming to be members of the Caldwell family. All with detailed memories of growing up together, all absolutely certain they'd always lived there. Sheriff Briggs attempted to verify identities through questioning. He asked for full names, birth dates, and places of birth. The answers were consistent among the family members, but impossible to verify against any existing records. He asked Thomas to produce any documentation. Marriage license, property deed, tax records. Thomas handed over papers showing his tenancy agreement dated 1890, listing him, his wife Martha, and 3 children as occupants. The sheriff pointed out that 19 people now lived on a property leased for 5. Thomas looked genuinely confused. "We've always been this many," he said. "The agreement must be wrong." The deputy suggested they might all be experiencing some shared nervous affliction brought on by the economic depression. Mass hysteria wasn't uncommon in isolated farming communities under severe stress. Sheriff Briggs noted this theory in his report, but admitted he had no explanation for why perfect strangers would suddenly believe they were all related, or how so many people could physically fit into a cabin with only 2 small rooms and a sleeping loft. He did note one other detail in his report, a detail that bothered him enough to underline it twice. When he'd asked the 19 individuals to stand together for a count, he'd noticed they all moved in an unnaturally synchronized way. Not quite in unison, but close, like members of the same body responding to the same impulse a fraction of a second apart. The landowner, Mr. Charles Bexley, evicted the entire group on October 15th. His legal notice cited violation of tenancy terms by exceeding the agreed-upon occupancy limit. He gave them 1 week to vacate. Thomas Caldwell signed the notice without argument. He seemed relieved, actually. "Getting too crowded anyway," he told Mr. Bexley. "We'll find somewhere with more room for everyone." But when the sheriff returned on October 22nd to ensure the eviction had been carried out, he found the cabin empty, completely empty. No people, no furniture, no possessions, just dust and silence. The cotton had been picked clean, baled, and stacked neatly behind the cabin. Approximately 4 times the yield a family of 5 could harvest in an entire season. The work of many hands over many days. Sheriff Briggs interviewed neighbors. No one had seen the Caldwells leave. No wagons had been spotted on the road. One morning, the property had been full of people. The next morning, it stood abandoned. Mrs. Fletcher reported that she'd watched the cabin all day on October 21st. She'd counted 23 people that afternoon. By nightfall, there were none. The final piece of documentation comes from the Bastrop County census records for 1900. In the section listing residents who'd moved away or died since the previous census, there's a single entry for the Caldwell family. It lists Thomas Caldwell, Martha Caldwell, and their 3 children, James, Sarah, and William, as having relocated to an unknown destination in October 1893. No forwarding address was ever provided. No subsequent records exist for any of them anywhere in Texas or surrounding states. Dr. Norton's journal from November 1893 contains a brief entry about the incident. He writes that he examined the abandoned cabin thoroughly, looking for some rational explanation. He found marks on the floor where furniture had stood. He found a child's carved toy horse in the loft. He found normal signs of human habitation, but he also found something else. In the main room, carved into the wooden support beam, was a series of marks. Tally marks, scratched into the wood with something sharp. The doctor counted them. 32 marks, 5 crossed out. The remaining 27 arranged in groups that seemed to follow some pattern he couldn't decipher. Beneath the marks, someone had carved 3 words in shaky letters. "Stop bringing us." The doctor never determined who carved those words or what they meant. He noted in his journal that the handwriting didn't match Thomas Caldwell's signature on his tenancy agreement. It was smaller, more cramped, desperate. He wondered if one of the original 5 family members had carved it. Perhaps one of the children, watching their family grow beyond recognition, adding person after person after person until nothing remained of who they'd been before. The beam was removed when Mr. Bexley demolished the cabin in 1894 to build a larger structure. The carved words were lost, but Mrs. Fletcher swears she saw smoke rising from the property in late October 1893, though the cabin had already been abandoned. Thick black smoke that smelled wrong, like burning hair and copper. When she and her husband investigated the next morning, they found nothing but ash in a circle around where the cabin had stood. Reverend Clay's final diary entry about the Caldwells, dated November 15th, 1893, reads, "I have prayed for guidance regarding the matter of the disappeared family. The Lord has shown me that some questions are not meant to be answered by mortal men. I suspect the Caldwells found something in that soil, or perhaps something found them. I suspect they are still together, wherever they are. I suspect they are still growing." The land where the Caldwell cabin stood has remained empty since 1894. 6 different families have attempted to farm it over the past 30 years. None have stayed longer than a single season. They all report the same problem. Their families feel wrong after a few months on that property. Too many people at the dinner table, too many children sleeping in the beds, too many voices calling goodnight after the lamps are blown out. They can't quite remember who belongs and who doesn't, but they know something has multiplied beyond what should be. Current county records show 23 families currently residing in Bastrop County. The 1893 census listed 22. No births have been registered to account for the additional family. When asked, County Clerk Miss Judith Parsons couldn't explain the discrepancy. "Must be a filing error," she said, "though I could have sworn there were only 22 last month when I reviewed the books. Memory plays tricks sometimes, especially during tax season." 2 weeks ago, a family named Morrison signed a lease for the old Caldwell property. They plan to plant cotton next spring. According to the landowner, Mr. Bexley's son James, the Morrisons are a family of 4. Husband, wife, and 2 daughters. They moved their belongings into the rebuilt cabin last Tuesday. This morning, Census Clerk Miss Parsons updated her records. She listed 5 Morrisons. She's absolutely certain that's how many there have always been.